All right, well, I see we're at 3 o'clock, so I think we're going to go ahead and get rolling. I'd like to welcome you all to the Champlain Valley Petal Fall thinning meeting. For those of you, if you haven't been on Zoom in a little while, just a quick reminder, if you hover over the bottom of your screen, your toolbar should pop up. We ask that you please make sure your microphone is muted and that your video is off. When we get to the end of the presentations, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your questions to the speakers though. If you do have any questions that you'd like to get out during the presentations though, there is the chat box. We ask that you put those in there and we can get those answered for you in a timely fashion. So I'd like to thank our sponsor of these meetings, Valent. We're happy that they are our sponsor again and appreciate them working with us. So we just wanted to give a shout out to them. And then just to get into our agenda for the day, as I alluded to in the last email out to the group, we do have a little bit of an interesting meeting today. We are going to sort of split it up with the Western New York group. So we're going to start off with Dr. Robinson, who's going to walk us through his thinning recommendations for the Champlain Valley during the Petal Fall thinning window. After that, folks from Western New York are going to be joining in. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Kerik, who's going to discuss disease management updates. And then Dr. Monique Rivera, who's going to discuss insect management. We'll then have a call for final questions from the Champlain Valley. And then after that, we'll get off the meeting and the Western New York folks are going to continue with Terence for their petal fall thinning recommendations. So with that, we'll get into Champlain Valley petal fall thinning. And just to set the scene, I went out the last couple days just to have a look at things to see how things are shaping up so far in Clinton County in particular. And from my observations, just looking at some of the different varieties in general, Honeycrisp looks like there's a nice bloom this year. There's a few off blocks here and there, but overall I'd say we're generally in an on year. Looking at the clusters themselves, I've noticed that there's some slight to moderate king damage here and there, really varies between blocks. So I do recommend getting out and having a look before you start your petal fall thinning. And generally speaking, measuring kings today, most of them are falling between 3 and 4 millimeters. Looking at max, as we usually expect, a really strong bloom on them. Very, very slight king damage in one of the spots that I looked at. And kings again are ranging about 3 to 4 millimeters in size at this point. Gala had good bloom, very, very little king damage on them. And again, kings are generally in the 2 to 4 millimeter range at this point. Looking at some Snapdragon or New York 1 blocks, bloom was a bit more variable on these this year depending on the location. I saw very little cold damage in these, and at this point, the kings in those are probably also 3 to 4 millimeters. McCown seemed to be in an on year, generally very strong bloom on the blocks that I looked at, very little king damage to speak of, and the kings are a little bit smaller, 2 to 3 millimeters. And then in the Cortland blocks that I looked at, really nice bloom, very little king damage, and again, kings are about 3 to 4 at this point. Looking at our conditions, bloom really came on quick. Thursday to Friday, it seemed in the Peru area, we had those really hot temperatures and things really picked up. I think we were at pink probably on Thursday, and pretty much by Saturday, we were full bloom on a couple different varieties. So it came on fast. We had hot, sunny Thursday, Friday, and portions of Saturday. So I think we had really nice pollination weather for that early part of bloom. And then we had slightly less ideal conditions Sunday through Tuesday as we had the rain showers move in, and it's certainly been windy as well since then. But overall, I think we've had pretty good conditions for pollination so far this year. So I'm expecting set should be pretty good. And then just another note, bloom thinning with ATS or NAA was achieved in some spots in between strep sprays this past weekend and the last couple of days. Though, as I just mentioned, it had been fairly difficult to get a window just because we were trying to get covered up with our scab and fire blade sprays needing to be a top priority. So that pretty much sets the scene. So now I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Robinson. Terence, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you again. Start this thinning period during the petal fall. I begin with a slide that I've shown many, many times, indicating that this is only one step in a series of spray efforts to reduce crop load from the initial number that we have to a target number through these sequential petal fall 10 millimeter and 18 millimeter sprays. The program is designed so that there's about a week's time between each one of the sprays. So today we're going to focus on the petal fall sprays, and we try to time those to this period between 110 degree days after full bloom and 130 degree days after full bloom. This year, you'll see in the data in a minute, that's just a 3-day window. But if we do it in that timing, there's about a week before we'll have to come back with our 10 to 12 millimeter spray between the 200 and the 250 degree day period. I also want to emphasize here at the beginning that beginning at this point in time, the carbon balance model becomes very useful in helping us predict what's going to happen when we thin, when to avoid thinning, to not risk over thinning, and when we will expect very little thinning and need to use increased rates. It's also right after this spray that's coming up that we would measure fruit diameters at 2 times, 3 days and about 7 days after application, to determine how many fruits are falling off and how many are persisting. The combined effects of what people did at bloom with either ATS or NAA, plus what we will do over the next few days at petal fall, will be evident in this fruit growth rate model. And I'll end my presentation with a plea for you to participate this year by measuring fruit diameters. I appreciate Mike giving a more detailed summary of what has happened so far this year. I'll add just a few of my comments. Compared to the last several years, green tip was a little later in this 2022 year than in other years. Mike has told me that green tip varied between April 10th and April 15th in the Champlain Valley. Following that green tip start, temperatures were relatively cool between green tip and first bloom. And that period of time was about 1 month. However, as Mike indicated, very warm temperatures from first bloom or late pink resulted in a very rapid and quick bloom and rapidly entering the petal fall period. I'm pleased to hear that bloom in most blocks was very good. We're targeting this full bloom date somewhere May 12th to May 14th in the Champlain Valley, depending on variety. I want to just pause and mention that full bloom is not early bloom. Full bloom is defined when 80% of all the flowers on the tree are open. And so that's not the date of first bloom. Now, as Mike indicated, there is a little tiny bit of winter damage in some blocks with either poorly formed clusters with only 1 or 2 flowers or the king missing. On the positive side, the temperatures were warm and we had really good bee activity during bloom, and we've had essentially no frost. This should lead to very, very good fruit set. Now, one of the things we start to do at petal fall is start to look at the predicted carbon deficit as we move through this period. This is a screenshot of the carbon balance model for Peru, New York, taken this morning when I ran the model. And I want to emphasize 3 important points about what you should look at when you run the model. First, in the 2 columns where there's the carbohydrate status, it will show the daily status and this 7-day weighted average. We pay more attention to the 7-day weighted average because a single negative carbon balance day is not enough to trigger thinning. You need at least 2 to 3 days. And so we take this 7-day average a couple of days before and 3 days after application to really look at what's going to be the impact of a thinner that went on. And so you'll see in this 7-day weighted average, starting on May 14th, which I put as full bloom, we went to minus 29, minus 19, minus 12, minus 14, minus 17, minus 19 for tomorrow, predicted for tomorrow. In the next to the last column was a new column we added a year ago, which shows the degree day accumulation from the date you put in as full bloom, which in this case was May 14th. And you'll see that as of today, May 18th, at the Peru, we're at about 65 degree days. And I've indicated in the previous slide that we want to wait to put on our petal fall sprays till we get to around 110 degree days up to 130. And I'll show on the slide in a minute showing when we predict to get there. In the last column is a recommendation if you choose to thin on any of those days during bloom or any of the days now up through petal fall. And generally, the recommendation is to increase the amount of chemical thinner, even though temperatures are relatively warm. But that is because the amount of deficit we got is a modest deficit. It's not a huge deficit. And so full rates were justified up until now. When you look at this carbohydrate balance in graphical form, you get this graph that shows a huge dip starting about May the 6th. Well, May the 6th was not too bad, but then May 7th all the way down through May 12th. Then it reached this lowest point of around minus 40 because of the heat. And then it's recovered a little bit and gotten less negative up until yesterday, and then a little bit dip as we went from yesterday to today and tomorrow. I'll have you note that the solid blue line across the top is the zero line. So far this year, we have not had any period of time of a surplus of carbohydrates. Now, in many years, we're looking at a surplus. Now, that is challenging thinning weather. And so having deficits is helpful when we're trying to thin. But if you look at where we are today on the 18th, the next to the last dot, where we'll be tomorrow, we're still a couple of days away from what we call this thinning window, which starts when we get 110 degree days. Exactly where we'll be about 3 days from now is not totally clear yet, because the carbohydrate model will only really predict 1 day forward. However, as you see here on the bottom, it does predict the degree days as we move forward. And so it shows that when we get to May 21st, we will be right at about 108, close to 110 degree days. So I've said that the petal fall thinning window opens on Saturday, May 21st, and will only last for 3 days, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, before we get past this 132 degree days. It's interesting when you look at the forecast, May 21st, Saturday is predicted to have a high temperature of 91. And probably more concerning is a nighttime temperature of 68 degrees. Anytime nighttime temperatures are above 60, that really gives potent thinning. And a daily carbohydrate deficit of minus 78, which is serious. But that's followed by 2 days of cool temperatures that don't crack 70. And in those cases, the deficits are much more modest, or even a surplus on Monday. So when you look at spraying in any one of those 3 days, we can't put too much weight on just 1 day of serious deficits, because we've shown many years that 1 day of a serious deficit is not enough to cause excessive thinning. But if we piece together 3 days of really high temperatures, then we can be at risk of over thinning. So the column in here with blanks is the average. It's not available until tomorrow to see what that average is going to be. So I encourage you to run the model tomorrow for your area. But it looks like that even spraying Saturday under the heat will probably be a reasonable. In fact, if it was me, I would go ahead and spray Saturday, assuming it's not too windy and not raining, and I can get the spray on to take advantage of some of that deficit. So let me talk a little bit about some of the thoughts I have for you today about thinning this year. I do acknowledge that it is still too early to really assess accurately the fruit set in the Champlain Valley, but all indications are that it's very good. You really have to wait till fruits get up to 5 to 6 millimeters to really adequately assess the set. But because we expect that it's going to be really good, the Petal Fall spray that we hope that you will put on is really an important component of this year's thinning program. In blocks with strong set, you need a full dose of either NaN7 or NaDN7, even though there's a 90-degree temperature predicted for Saturday. But you need the full dose because it's followed by 2 or 3 days of cool temperatures. But I expect that that thinning spray applied Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday will give really good thinning. And I cite as evidence several years of experience where we had warm temperatures at Petal Fall. The most recent one was last year in Western New York. In our experiments where we sprayed at different timings, 80% or almost 90% of the thinning we got came from a Petal Fall spray under warm conditions. It never over thins at Petal Fall because it's a relatively safe timing, but we should take advantage of this deficit that we're looking at on Saturday to get our Petal Fall thinning spray on and hopefully get some really good thinning out of it. Who knows what's going to happen at 12 millimeters? It could be cool and have carbohydrate surplus and the thinners won't work very well. That's exactly what happened in Western New York in 2021. If people did not spray a Petal Fall spray, then they couldn't get very good thinning because at 10 millimeters, it was bad weather. So I look at this as an actual blessing. And the temperatures this year that are going to be above 80 also give us an opportunity to use Maxell at Petal Fall. So if you get your spray on either Friday afternoon, evening before the 90-degree temperature on Saturday, or even on Saturday in the middle of that 90 degrees, Maxell and 7 will probably do a very good job of thinning with Gala, Empire, Snapdragon, and Fuji. And this is a year when I would switch to Maxell and 7 for those varieties, whereas many of the other varieties, particularly Honeycrisp and Max, I would stick with NA and Cortland's and McCown's, I would stick with NaN7 or NaDN7. Just a reminder, see if at all possible, try to hit these degree day windows, but they're not cast in stone. You can spray earlier than that window or later than that window, but that's the window where you tend to get the best benefit and still gives you enough time to assess the response of thinners before you have to come in and make a decision at 12 millimeters. At Petal Fall, we have several options for thinners. Some people that are conservative would spray only carbaryl alone with nothing else, just put it in the spray tank. It can be a small insecticide addition. It does give some thinning, and this year with the heat, it should do a pretty good job. Others have liked Amanthin over the years and would spray that alone. And in fact, our more recent research with Amanthin has always been pretty positive. But the combinations of either Maxell and 7, NAA and 7, or NAD and 7 have been the most consistent performers at Petal Fall thinning with the hard to thin varieties. Now, there are some people who would prefer not to use carbaryl in their spray program for marketing reasons. And so if you're wanting to have a carbaryl-free program, Maxell and NAA instead of NaN7 has given really good responses in the last 10 years that we've tested that combination for many years. Lastly, I'll point out that in the 1 or 2 years, we expect a brand new thinner called Metametron, trade name will be Brevis, which will also thin at Petal Fall, but it's not available this year. I have several suggestions for you in terms of thinning in 2022. I see that I didn't change the year, but I would really encourage you to run the carbohydrate model the day you want to spray, right before you mix the sprayer. There's both a web-based version at NUA and at malusim.org. You can log into either NUA or malusim.org and find the carbohydrate model. And there's also a mobile phone version that's available. We just updated that a little bit, and I would encourage you to download a new phone version from the App Store or the Android App Store. One thing that we've learned over the years that when this carbohydrate model, the 7-day average, gives us an average deficit of -60 or lower, that's when we get over thinning. And so we would say, if you get to that situation, don't thin. It doesn't look to me like that 90 degrees on Saturday will give us a 7-day average of -60. But we'll have to check that in the morning when it gives us a further prediction for that day. Remember that at Petal Fall, all thinners have a moderate effect and are thus very safe. Another way to say that in a negative way is they're not very good at Petal Fall. Why do we use them? Because we need the additional thinning that we get from them to achieve this full thinning, precision thinning that we're after. A positive way to look at this is that there's little risk of over thinning. So I think every block on the farm should get a Petal Fall thinner. The carbohydrate model indicates there will be a significant deficit Friday, Saturday, and a little bit Sunday, and that will help get good thinning. And so I don't want you to worry and be afraid to spray on this window, which really opens up Friday evening, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. I decided to include just my full program or suggested program for both Honeycrisp and Gala, since they're two hard to thin varieties. I would hope that many of you got some ATS on at bloom, either 2.5 or 3%. Now at Petal Fall, during this window of 110 to 130 degree days between 5 and 6 millimeters, my suggestion is 3 ounces of NAA per 100 and a pint of 7 per 100. When we move forward to the 11 to 13, 12 millimeter timing, I like another 3 ounces, but that depends on the temperatures that we get then and what the carbohydrate model says. Now, if everything goes bad and we don't get any thinning and we really need more thinning, you can come back in at 15, 16, 17, 18 millimeters, usually not past 18 millimeters, and spray a combination of Maxell, 7, and oil, and that's done a really good job. I want to add that this year, Valent Corporation has received registration for their new thinner called Exceed. But I understand they're not selling it on the open market. They will allow you to try it under their guidance. And it does work quite well at large fruit size. So if you get in a situation where you didn't get thinning and you need more thinning and the fruits are already getting big, I would say contact your Valent representative. And I would suggest a combination of Maxell and Exceed to achieve thinning at 18 millimeters. With Gala, I like basically a Maxell-based program. So at Bloom, NAA or Amid Thin works quite well with Gala. ATS also works well, but these other two are not quite so critical for their timing. But once we get into Petal Fall, I'd prefer to switch to Maxell and 7 at Petal Fall and at the 10 to 13 or 11 to 13 millimeters and at the large fruit size if needed. Some other suggestions are, just to repeat myself, the best window appears to be Saturday, May 21st in the heat, Sunday and through Monday, May 23rd, whenever there's a window with not too much wind and no rain. I suggest you use full rates of 3 ounces of NAA plus a pint of 7 on Honeycrisp, Gala, Snapdragon, and McCowan. Now, especially McCowan needs that higher rate of NAA. For McIntosh, the slightly lower rate of 2 ounces of NAA plus a pint of 7 works very well. I repeat my opinion that for Cortland, I don't like to include carbaryl. It seems to thin too long and too big of fruits keep falling off. But this year, with warm temperatures, I would switch to a Maxell and 7 on Gala. Next, I would like to just review with you the fact that these recommended rates for me are the same as those printed in the Cornell recommends, but they are rates that are based on a dilute tree roll volume application. If you don't apply a full dilute spray, then you have to calculate a concentration factor. So this bulleted point here is important. For every orchard, calculate the tree row volume and then calculate the concentration factor. That is the tree row volume divided by the amount of water you're actually going to spray. That's the concentration factor. For example, let's suppose a mature tall spindle spaced about 3 by 12, 12 feet tall, measures at 200 gallons for a full dilute spray. But I'm not going to haul that much water. I'm only going to spray 100 gallons. So the 200 divided by 100 gives me a concentration factor of 2. Then I have to use that with the rates that Terence Robinson rates up here above to adjust to how much goes in the tank. So I have to multiply the Robinson suggested rates by the concentration factor to get rate per acre. The example is, let's suppose I'm spraying Honeycrisp and I'm going to use this 3 ounces per 100 of NA. I then multiply it by 2, which is the concentration factor because I'm only carrying half the water for a full dilute spray. That gives me 6 ounces per 100 gallons in my spray tank. Now my sprayer, let's assume it's a 500-gallon sprayer. So I have 5 of these 100-gallon units. So I have to multiply 5 times 6. So 30 ounces of NA goes in the sprayer. Then I spray my 100 gallons and I've got the full rate that I should on every tree. Now this is critical for calculating how much NA goes in a sprayer or how much Maxell goes in a sprayer. But we don't generally use this concentration factor to adjust how much carbaryl or surfactants go in the sprayer. That's just a pint per 100. And if you have a 500-gallon sprayer, you put 5 pints in the sprayer because more than that is not in solution. And I like to just put what's in solution for thinning. Now, I want to mention that the recent research that we've been doing the last few years, and particularly last year with a group of people from around the country in a national project on precision crop load management, has shown that we probably should be carrying slightly higher crop loads with Gala and Honeycrisp than what I've been suggesting in the past. The data showed that when we carry 8 fruits per square centimeter of trunk cross-sectional areas where we maximize crop value and income. But with Honeycrisp, we should not, previously we would have said carry only 5 fruits per square centimeter, but the data shows we should be carrying 6 fruits per square centimeter of trunk cross-sectional area. With McIntosh, somewhere in between, and Snapdragon, somewhere in between, I'm suggesting 7 fruits. Now this relationship works up through about year 8 or 9. If you have trees that are older than that, then it doesn't work because the trunk keeps getting bigger every year, but we prune it to basically the same size to keep it within its space. I have several tips that I want to pass along for your successful thinning this year. And like Mike said, I emphasize again, go out and look at flower quality in each block. See if the king is there. See if there's all 5 flowers in the cluster. When most kings are present, use full rates and follow what the carbohydrate model says. If tomorrow it says you should reduce rates a little bit if you spray Saturday, then do it. I don't think it's going to say that. Now, if kings are missing, then I would use moderate rates at petal fall and just try to make sure we take off some fruit, but wait and see really what we end up with as we get towards the 10, 11, and 12 millimeter timing. But remember, you can make a really good crop from lateral flowers, but let's not over thin it at petal fall. Time your sprays either at petal fall or the 12 millimeter based on degree days for the best results. I emphasize again something we say most every year, and that is the nozzling of the sprayer makes a big difference on results in thinning sprays. If you sprayed blossom thinning ATS or NA, we generally like to use uniform nozzling from top to bottom on your sprayer bank. But when we get to this stage, we want to put 2/3 of the spray in the top half of the tree and only 1/3 in the bottom half of the tree. So re-nozzle for this spray to the more traditional 2/3, 1/3. When we get to 12 millimeter, however, though, we want more spray in the top. And so 75 or 80% of the spray should go on the top and only 20% in the bottom. And if you end up having to spray at 18 millimeter, just shut off the bottom nozzles, because often in almost every case, we overthin the bottom of the tree with that 12 millimeter and 18 millimeter spray. Now, some people like to put surfactants with the thinners, and this could be an issue, and I want to address it right now. If Kerik tells you later in this webinar to spray streptomycin with this Petal spray, then the question becomes, do I put Regulate in for the strep? However, Regulate can have a dramatic effect on the NAA response. So I would say on years when we have a carbohydrate surplus and there's no deficit, you can go ahead and include the Regulate for the strep, or the Regulate just to make NAA more effective. But this year, when there's a carbohydrate deficit, I would ask that you not include the Regulate, even if you're spraying streptomycin. Now, how do you really know whether or not you're going to do the job that we hope with this bloom and petal fall sprays? The answer is to measure fruitlets using the fruit growth rate model about 50 degree days after this petal fall spray and 100 degree days after the petal fall spray. I'm willing to help interpret your data if you'll do the measurements and send me the data. Our suggested protocol is to pick 5 representative trees and count all the clusters on the tree. But remember, we don't count bloom on 1-year wood. Then tag 15 spurs on that tree from the top to the bottom, and then measure their diameter about 50 days after this petal fall application. So if you're going to spray Saturday, you'd wait another 50 days, which is probably Monday or possibly Tuesday, and measure them. And then when you accumulate 100 degree days, you remeasure them again and enter that data in the MaluSim fruit growth rate model on the phone app or on your computer, and it will calculate how many fruits are setting. I put up this slide again. This is from last year at a 200 degree day, 12 millimeter spray. Suppose you sprayed on this May 26th last year. You would then look forward until you got to 50 degree days beyond that 200, which would be somewhere down here on May 31st or June 1st to make your first measurements. Last year during that period, it was cool in the 50s and low 60s. And so it took 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days to take your first measurement. On warm years, it'll be only 3 days to get to that 250 degree days more. Now, I want to emphasize, I wrote here in text, if you go to the website, malusim.org on your laptop, and you run the fruit growth rate model there, or with your phone app, there are error detection protocols that we've incorporated to help prevent incorrect assessments of fruit set. But if you do that, then you can determine how many fruits are falling off so that at the 12 millimeter stage, you'll be more confident in what you're going to spray. This is a picture, just as I wrap up, of what that looks like, the fruit growth rate model at malusim.org. You enter the data and you tell it how many fruits you think by counting 5 trees. In this case, it was a snapdragon. There were 635 potential fruits, assuming 5 per cluster, and the grower wanted 85. So last year with bloom and petal fall spray, at the first set of measurements, he found there was only 140 fruits left out of 635. So he got pretty close to just perfect thinning just with that petal fall spray. And he then decided maybe he would apply a little more thinner or not at all at 12 millimeter, but that's what the fruit growth rate model helped him understand. And that's why I encourage you to measure it, measure fruitlet diameter. So with that little injunction and plea, I'd like to stop and answer questions now or later, depending on what you feel, Mike, and what the time is. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Terence. We do have a question in the chat box that I think it'd be great if you could address now. And I'd also like to invite any other Champlain Valley folks, if you have any questions for Terence, please go ahead and get those in now. Terence, one question that did come up is, I'm not familiar with the multiplier or not using the multiplier on 7. Is that a new recommendation? This grower says he's been using the 2x concentration for both the NA and the 7. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
That's not a new recommendation, but I just have had trouble over a 30-year career ever getting that message out. So I put it in more clearly this year. The basis of that is that carbaryl has a limited solubility of about 1 pint in every 100 gallons. So if in a 500-gallon sprayer you put in 5 pints, only that amount gets into solution. And it's only the amount in solution that can be taken into the leaf to cause thinning. When you put in a second pint per 100, that extra amount of carbaryl is not in solution. It's mixed and it's floating around and gets sprayed out and gets deposited on the leaf, but not absorbed into the leaf. And therefore it does no thinning except if you get re-wetting. So this is the issue. If you need more thinning, I'd go ahead and put in the double carbaryl rate, because I hope there's a little bit of rain that will get more carbaryl dissolved and taken into the leaf. But it's risky. If you have hot temperature, you keep getting rain, you keep getting more carbaryl in there, and you often get more thinning than what you expected. So I prefer not to have that extra carbaryl around. In most years, it doesn't create a big problem. But on the years when it's a lot of thinning happening and we're getting a little bit of re-wetting, people get more thinning than they want. Does that make any sense?
He says yes. Thank you, Terence.
Okay.
So with that, Terence, I do just have one more quick question for you, just to reemphasize really. I know when I see that 90-degree mark that we're going to have on Saturday, it's got me shaking in my boots, particularly when we're talking about Maxell, where we just see more activity. Again, you feel comfortable with that being its petal fall, that we shouldn't see over thinning if we are putting that out on that day?
Absolutely. I want you to come away from this being confident to spray Saturday. Don't miss that window. It's petal fall. There's no risk. If this was 10 millimeters, I would tell you wait, but it's not. And a petal fall over that 18 years we did every year, petal fall. Even on hot years, we don't get over thinning, but on years where we got heat, we get good thinning, and that really, really helps. So I would say take advantage. I want to just clearly state, take advantage of that good day you're going to have Saturday, assuming it's not too windy.
Okay. Even if you got ATS out and think you might have knocked some off with bloom too, you'd still go with it?
Yes, even if you put ATS out.
Okay. Thank you. I don't see any other thinning questions.
There's one in there, Mike, about organic thinning recommendations.
Okay. Thanks, Craig.
So are there any organic thinners that work? Yes, lime sulfur and oil, fish oil particularly, does work fairly well if you time it with the pollen tube growth model. The problem we have for organic growers in New York is it's not technically legal, because the only lime sulfur we have available prohibits its use during bloom. I don't know how to get around that legally. And so it's really a problem for organic production in New York.
All right. Thank you, Terence. So with that, I think we'll just have a quick transition here. Craig, do you want to introduce the Western New York
Sure.
portion?
Greetings, Western New York folks. For those who are confused and didn't read our emails thoroughly, if you came on a little early, you caught the end of Terence's recommendation for the Champlain Valley. We're piggybacking on Mike's webinar because the timing is about the same for us, for a lot of us. I'll let Mike reintroduce Kerik and Monique, and after that, Terence will wrap up with the Western New York thinning recommendations. So don't be afraid that you've missed something. And I'll also ask that Liz, you'll start recording on the cloud now, please. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Craig. And with that, thank you again, Terence, for your recommendations. And with that, I would like to invite our next speaker up, Dr. Kerik Cox from Geneva, to talk about making sense of the weather we've had the last couple of days and looking forward to the next few.
All right, let's go through the Western Northern New York petal fall disease update. Both trying to cram in both regions into one set of predictions. And as you can probably tell, it's hard to determine if it's going to rain, it's not going to rain. If it looks like it does outside here in Geneva, where it's kind of 50 degrees and overcast and kind of cool, this is some serious scab weather, and nothing I'm going to say here is going to protect you against that. It's happening now. Hopefully you caught some of those over the weekend predictions, and you had something on before we had all that rain on Monday. We'll talk about that in a bit. What's it look like for apple scab? Moving the head over here. Put that up at the really tippity top. It's cut off a little bit. It's all right. Pretty mild winter. Pretty warm weather through northern November to early January. Some cold weather in February, but a lot of warm days. Some 75s even down in the Finger Lakes area, and some high 50s off and on. It just sort of came. We had green tip end of March, April, depending on where you were. A lot of really some bunch of cold days, short bouts of this really hot weather, no hard spring freezes, but a reasonable amount of rain right at the beginning of green tip. But it's kind of a sort of slow season start, but it really kicked up quickly as we got some really hot weather that we just experienced a couple weeks ago. Low snow cover, I thought, a lot of rain at green tip, making it probably challenging for everyone to get that urea and early season copper on, but at least it was slow, giving it a couple chances for that ground to dry out a bit. But probably more as you move closer into half-inch green, which is still all right. So what else? What do we have going on for scab? A lot of early season possibilities for ejection, but watching the different models, Rim-Pro, NUA, watching them all, but for the most part, temperatures were just often not warm enough, or the leaf wetness wasn't long enough to really get that infection in. Now, particularly if you were really well buffered against the radical climate along the lake, you could have missed out some of these, but for the most part, the big infections for the two regions, Western New York and the Lake Champlain area, were about 5.2 to 5.4, about 15 to, could be as high as 30% ejection depending on where you were. And the big one was recently around this Monday, Sunday type sort of period, about 30%. And for some people, this just kept going on all the way through the day if you didn't get enough drying out. But a pretty light scab season so much so far with these two regions. Watch out for the storms like the one we're in right now for apple scab. That's when things are going to get a little exciting. So here's the two events. You can kind of see some Lake Champlain really sort of floating around in that 15%. And this is where you can see like, oh, we always get ejection and a little bit off depending on second, fourth, whatever. Some leaf wetness here. It could be quite long. It might have been a short period here. And these vary depending on the specific sites, because you get closer to the lake, things change. As you get lower to the south, things change in the Finger Lakes. And as you get up to Peru, and sort of that area up in Lake Champlain was more closer to the Finger Lakes in terms of the types of stuff that we've seen, even though they're a little bit further behind. We're getting some of the same storms, so to speak. But we had some. On the 15th, this is the big one. You can see almost as high as 40 in some places, and you can see this is one of these days where it just started raining on Sunday night into Monday and kind of just sort of kept that leaf wetness going with those low temperatures that we're seeing around there, 50s and 52s. We just left that really hot spike. And same with Lake Champlain. It just keeps going. And look, here's the spike that we're in right now, that 10% sort of blast out. So what did we end up finding for fire blight? March and April. Yep, it's cold, short bouts of warm weather. Orchards in Eastern New York they're almost done. They're pretty much, and they're in their prolonged period. But here we're really getting kind of hit. And in the early last 2 years in the Western Northern New York area and the New England area, you get these really kind of cold blooms with a really warm, dry petal fall. And they sort of lead to the sort of devastating shoot blight epidemics. Right at petal fall, everything seems to be off, and it might be dry. Right now we're going into a cold, wet period, and we're going to hit some really hot weather at the end of the week, and then we could be in another one of these, and we'll see sort of the how the predictions pan out. And as things go, even if it is too dry and you've got no flowers on the tree, we're beginning to learn that fire blight can just still come in at those last few weeks in petal fall and cause trouble, particularly when you got young shoot growth. And remember, even if it's a desert out there, dew from grass, humidity in the canopy, or even water from an application can do this. And this is what happens in Washington State. They're growing stuff in a desert, and just anything, the slightest amount of change in weather popping up a dew event in the morning, even if NUA isn't registering dew, don't think that the canopy can't be holding it, and you can get fire blight. So as it stays hot, make sure you finish strong and make sure all those petals are way off the tree and you get into sort of millimeter fruit thinning weather before you let up on them. This is what it kind of looked like in the old days. You get this really cold blooms, goes on forever, and all the flowers are off right here. But look, we have these really nasty hot weathers. We had a lot of fire blight epidemics. Now, This is what it looks like kind of now in the worst places. If you are along the lake, all of these predictions are going to scale back, and you might even be okay not going after fire blight. It's kind of cool and wet right now. It's going to heat right up with this change in the storms, and you're going to be in some high risk weather. As we're pulling back into May 22nd, there will be some water predicted, even if it isn't showing up in these particular slides. This is bimodal event. We had a really nasty period along the full bloom for most places, or the mid bloom, and now it's going into another bout of extreme weather, and there will be a little bit of water predicted coming up in the future. I was just looking at the forecasts. This could be around Sunday, Monday, but it could all go away with our erratic climate. If you're more protected along the lake, you might see a more consistent prediction. So stay ready and make sure this fire blight's there. So it's going to be hot over the weekend, rain on Sunday. Make sure you're protected through the last bit of petal fall, rat tail bloom, any storm Sunday, Saturday night, Sunday morning. If you're conventional, I'd say finish strong with strep. If you happen to have blister spot susceptible varieties like New York 1, Fuji, some of these other things, maybe you want to go to Kasuma. Kasugamycin does work really well on blister spot, but strep doesn't. While you still got a flower on the tree, you're still good. You cannot use it after petal fall. Organic, good time for Blossom Protect. As soon as this rain stops on Thursday, be a good chance to get that Blossom Protect out there and get that levels built up on the flowers. Don't put it with a fungicide. There are some you can use, but for the most part, as your tank mix is getting complex, might want to just try to get that individualized application if you have susceptible organic varieties. And, do this Saturday, maybe early Sunday, to be careful. Watch that rain, though. Do you need Regulate right now? I would say as long as you're finishing strong with a good application of strep, save the Regulate for your thinning and keep the Regulate use depending on your thinning recommendations. I think Terence is saying no Regulate in with your thinner because you might overthin in this hot weather. Don't put it in there for the fire blight. You're going to get a reasonable enough level of control without it. Pretty hot spring. We've had some really hot weather. We got some more 90s weather coming in the Finger Lakes. It's going to get pretty intense. Make sure that you don't let the shoots get out of control. This is where the shoot blight will hit you. So maybe that's 6 ounces per 100 of Pro-Hex. Or if you have a really young block, you can do this trial. It doesn't seem to impact shoots at all. We've done some trials here all over the state, looking at 2 ounces of pH and 1 ounce of Actigard. The Actigard itself was initially marketed for like herbaceous crops and annuals like tomatoes and things like that for bacterial diseases, and it's going to work really well on succulent shoots. So if you have a lot of young shoot growth, you don't want to slow down your young trees too much, you might get some pretty good bang for your buck with Actigard. If you got a big old standard tree, unless it's got a lot of vigorous growth, you might not see anything from either of these products. And I suspect they might work like any other PGR when it's going to be hot and you're going to get that activity, you're going to get better action from them. So in that case, you can kind of apply them with thinning Rex. All right, what's happening next? Okay, now that the petals are off the trees, this is where things are going to get serious. You're going to have small fruit. The potential for injury is really high, particularly with materials like Captan. If it's a cold, rainy day, the potential for Captan to injure in a complex tank mixture is very high. At the same time, these other things are going to be coming up. The glomerella leaf spot, the Marsanina, the bitter rot, and the fly speck sooty blotch. They all start their infections right around the beginning of petal fall to first cover. And these fancy fungicides typically don't cause injury. Don't put them with Captan or any other oily products just to be on the safe side. But everything we've got coming out now doesn't have a really oily formulation. Watch them, make sure they're well shaken. They are organics, and organic solvents tend to typically be oily. Just mix them up well. For the most part, I've not seen injury under slow drying, only when they get mixed with things like Captan. But you should be pretty good. Your group 7s will do really well on your glomerella or your Marsanina. You might not have glomerella unless you're really far east or south. And same with bitter rot. You might get a little bit of bitter rot at the end of the thing, but you can knock this inoculum down now, and the 7s and 11s are really good. At your various Colototricums or Marsaninas. And don't forget your group 3s, fantastic at first cover and that 10 to 15 millimeter timing for just getting rid of sooty blotch and fly speck inoculum throughout the summer. I used to do a couple studies where I would just really focus hard on managing this at petal fall and first cover, and even doing no summer program, you could have a fairly clean piece of fruit. So what are we thinking for summer? Going in, this petal fall, the first cover is a time when the fruit are really sensitive. Maybe sort of slide away from the Captan. You don't need to do Mancozeb anyway, and sort of You can use if you want to protect it with one of these, use the Mancozeb perhaps, and sort of get into some of your new fancy products. If you get heavy rains, 1.5 to 2 inches, you can make another fungicide application if it's greater than 7 days. But for the most part, we might be pretty dry, and you might be able to extend your summer cover interval out as you get in your harvest. And you can apply one of these single site fungicides, particularly the BASF products have low PHIs. You can get them on right before harvest, put them away, and get a little bit of sort of post-harvest protection in your fruit. With that, I'm gonna go ahead and cut myself off, and we will end this presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Kerik. Was just trying to find the unmute button on my screen here. If anybody has any questions for Kerik, please go ahead and type them into the chat box, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask quickly. Well, not seeing or hearing any. Thank you again, Kerik. And with that, I'd like to move to our next speaker, Dr. Monique Rivera, who is our new tree fruit entomologist for the state. Monique, you have the floor.
Hi, everybody. So after hearing about all of this weather variation, well, insects might also come into play quite a bit with that variation too. So I'm going to start with San Jose scale because right now is the time to sort of set out your monitoring for this pest. And really the goal here is to detect the first emergence of crawlers to prevent the armored stage of development. The armored stage is really hard to control because once they seal up onto the tree, it's really hard to get contact with insecticides. And so you want to scout for this, especially and in particular in areas with a history of scale infestation. And this can be pretty straightforward and cheap with black electrical tape around a limb as pictured on the right-hand side. So you can look at these 2 times a week. That's why I would focus on areas with a history or if they have active infestations. This is going to be the best place to scout for them. And I would also recommend having a 10x hand lens for this. So in terms of treatment options for this, softer insecticides for piercing sucking insects, which they are at this throughout their life cycle technically, even though they have that scale covering. So Movento, just remember that this product really worked best at petal fall first cover. If you hit it a little bit too early, that's not going to be good. There's also Savanto, which is a material that currently is thought of as be safe, but that could quickly be considered not be safe, just to put that on your radar. For this pest, you can also consider using insect growth regulators such as a steam or centaur. So mating disruption for this pest is in development. You're going to hear a lot of talk about mating disruption throughout this talk. And I'm just trying to put that bug in your ear because as the regulators continue to remove different AIs and products for insect control, it is important to know a secondary method that you could potentially use. So next, let's talk about plum curculio. If you have a problem with this, you are well aware of how bad and how quickly it can escalate. So you can see the adult there, and then around this time, you've got oviposition happening, and this can leave quite a bit of scarring on the fruit. The larva then develops inside of the fruit and comes out, and that creates additional larval feeding damage. Adults can also feed on the fruit, so it is kind of important to get them out of your orchard if you are having problems and have a history of problems with them. So here we have our adult on the right-hand side. So they technically, and most of the time, it's broadly thought of that they overwinter outside of apple orchards. Now, I have heard some people say that they might overwinter a little bit in any sort of, if you have a bunch of leaves underneath your trees, they could technically overwinter there, but it does seem to be commonly thought that they do migrate outside of the orchard. And so what happens is that around this time of the year, they start migrating into the edges of the orchards, and that's around 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit during bloom. So things are escalating fast. So it's really important to think of this pest, especially if you have a known history of in your orchard. Right now at bloom, they should be in the trees, and at petal fall, this oviposition is occurring. And the length of time of this oviposition depends on seasonal temperatures. And I'm assuming that that's happening exceptionally quickly with our hot temperatures. So effective control for these. So you can apply a preventative insecticide spray. basically from petal fall to the end of oviposition. And some suggestions for that would be Imidan, Actera, Avant, and Verdeprin. And if you're also finding European apple sawfly, these products will also work for that. So let's move on to tarnished plant bug. This is another one that if you have a history of infestation, might be important to consider. It feeds on the buds and flower parts in the spring and can cause a possible aborted fruit. They can have 2 to 3 generations per year, and that's part of why it might be important to catch this first one. And it's active in the early season on warmer days. Much like any other insects, they are ectotherms, so they're going to respond to this hot weather and become more active. You can monitor for these if this is an interest or part of your program, especially if you have an area that you know has had infestation and you want to catch them quickly. So white sticky panel traps along the border, you can set them at silver tip, which was much earlier in the season, and putting every trap every 3 to 5 acres, basically. And so if you're looking for an action threshold for these and tracking them throughout the season, I would suggest using 3 tarnished plant bugs average over 5 traps. That's in a very conservative action threshold that can be used up until bloom, unless there's a history of outbreak. So if there's this history of outbreak, it might be good to use this throughout the season to try to knock back the population in a more permanent manner. So 5 to 8 tarnished plant bugs per 5 traps is considered a really high population and commonly used threshold for post bloom. Now, I do want to mention that although I'm suggesting pyrethroids here, getting rid of your broadleaf weeds inside of the orchard is going to also be key to reducing these populations because they tend to hang out there. The risk with pyrethroids is that they can flare European red mite, which can be a whole secondary issue that no one wants. So I would use them with caution. So moving on to more mating disruption, this time for internal leps, so OFM and codling moth. So if you're thinking about doing this, now is a good time to hang ties. And so this technology we think is becoming easier to use over time, especially with the combinations of pests. So for example, you can get ties or puzzle pieces that have multiple pheromones in them for multiple leps. So the other advancement in this area is that you can put less dispensers per acre. So currently Sidetrack, which is a Trace product, is suggesting a rate of 32 dispensers per acre. Some of the products can be up to 200. So that's quite an improvement. And this is really best for larger blocks. You want to do this if you're thinking about establishing it in blocks that are 10 or more acres. And that being said, for New York State, we still have some questions that we need to address. But this is a risky investment in a certain way because you're basically that first year, if you decide not to spray for the internal leps, it could be really risky in the sense that you might have still an infestation that year and it might hurt your harvest and the resulting damage from these pests, which can be critical. So we really need to figure out what does this, the transition between spray program to mating disruption for these pests look like, so that we can give you a better idea of what this might look like in terms of your actual risk. And then, of course, another question is dispersal of pheromone under varying conditions. So with such wild ups and downs in terms of temperature, with just year-to-year differences, the dispersal of the pheromone from these products, in particular the spray dispensers, those tend, it's not really clear how well those persist in the environment. And if, say, you might need to have them dispense more of the product on, let's say, more humid days or less, or vice versa. So these are important questions that we need to answer specifically for New York State. That being said, let's talk about oblique-banded leaf roller and other lepidopterans. Pictured on the bottom is actually the spongy moth larvae, which Mike has told me that in Champlain Valley, we've been seeing a lot of them. And then this is the oblique-banded leaf roller at the top. So thinking about these as sort of a collective of lepidopterans, I think it's important to, for in particular the oblique-banded leaf roller, looking at bud clusters for 3% larval infestation. And I would follow that for all of them, assessing the parts of the plant that are key, you know, leaves, finding them on the leaves with chewing damage. If you're looking at 100 leaves, 3 of them might be a decently conservative treatment threshold. So in terms of treatments that you could use, BT is going to be the softest of the products. So products like Dipel, Agree, and Javelin. And then if you have a larger infestation, or you're using this in conjunction for possibly other pests, Delegate, Alticore, Exeril, and Verdeperin are other good choices to fit into the program, especially if you have overlapping pests where this can target multiple of them. So lastly, let's talk a little bit about aphids. We've got the woolly apple aphid on the top and rosy apple aphid on the bottom. So in terms of assessing if it's time to spray or not, examining clusters or terminal leaves for wingless adults and nymphs. One infested cluster, it equals it's time to treat, because these can take off very fast and become a huge population, causing lots of damage to the leaves on the tree. So treatment suggestions, again, Movento, this should be applied at first cover, Savanto, and Assail. And that's pretty much it. So if you guys have any questions about any of the product recommendations or any of the insects, or if there's any that I didn't mention, please feel free to ask.
All right, thank you very much, Monique. So at this point, I'd just like to invite all questions for Monique. Or also, if Champlain Valley folks have any other lingering questions for Terence or Kerik or Monique, now would be the time to get those in the chat box, or if you'd like, you can also unmute yourself and ask them directly.
Monique,
Yes.
do you have any more organic suggestions for controlling of these, like a steam?
I think the steam can work for some of the insect pests, in particular, probably the piercing sucking insects. But
I meant in trust. I'm sorry.
yeah, in trust also similarly, I haven't seen great efficacy. So I tend not to, and because I haven't worked with those products in Apple, I tend to not talk about the organic side. But if you want to email me, it's just monique.rivera@cornell.edu. I'd be more than happy to discuss some organic treatment options. It's certainly much more complicated. But again, you do, for the other side of that, have products like the pyrethrins. I forget the name of that product, but typically those two, Entrust and the pyrethrin product, are usually the two main ones used for organic. And there are organic BT options, I think.
All right, thank you,
You
Monique.
said BT?
The last time I worked with BT, there were organic options, but that's why I'm saying it might be good to shoot me an email and we can discuss specifically like your situation, and I can provide you information directly, because I haven't looked too much into the organic side.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
All right. Well, not seeing or hearing any other questions, just from the Champlain Valley side, this does conclude our meeting. Just some quick reminders. We're going to see how things shake out over the next couple days with the weather and the degree day accumulations. So I will be getting out a meeting announcement for the fruit set meeting probably sometime early next week. So please stay tuned. I'm planning to do that meeting as a hybrid. I'd like to meet in person, and we'll stream Terence in for his recommendations then. So keep an eye on your alerts. I'd like to thank our speakers, Terence, Monique, and Kerik, for their time, and also our sponsor, Valent, for sponsoring this program. So with that, I will end the meeting for the Champlain Valley and turn things back over to the Lake Ontario fruit team so that they can conclude their meeting. Thank you.